Beneath this man's heavy steel mail lay the coarse hairshirt of a monk, a secret garment he wore against his skin until the very day he died. William Longsword remained the most dangerous paradox of his era. A giant wielding a massive blade, capable of cleaving an enemy in two with a single strike, he sincerely dreamed of abandoning his power and his army for a monastic cell. There the heir hoped to pray for forgiveness for the sins of his father. The world remembered Rollo as a ferocious maritime predator who tore Normandy from the hands of kings with his teeth. However, William, born on French soil, became the first civilized Norman. The son spoke the language of those his ancestors were accustomed only to robbing. He raised walls where Rollo had left ash heaps. But the attempt to become one of them in the world of old Europe turned his life into a prolonged leap over an abyss. Today you will learn why his Viking brothers declared their chieftain a traitor and raised a rebellion at the gates of his capital. How a bastard born of a captive concubine outplayed the Carolingian kings at their own game. What secret was hidden by the Jumièges abbey he restored, and why a man who sought peace ended his journey on a treacherous bridge. In the year 927, when old Rollo handed power to his son, Normandy still knew no order. It was glowing hot iron on an anvil, and William had to either tame this chaos or burn alive within it. The irony of history. He was destroyed not by a Viking axe, but by that very civilized word he so desperately believed in. The year 927. The political map of Europe resembles a patchwork quilt soaked in blood and soot. In the north of present-day France, a wolf's enclave froze in anticipation, lands that old Rollo had turned into a personal beachhead. The Carolingian Empire, which once united the continent, is bursting at the seams, and on its ruins a new power has grown, Normandy, which neighbor counts still consider a temporary camp of raiders. At this time, something unheard of for the Scandinavian world is happening in Rouen. The old lion Rollo, whose roar had made France shudder for decades, decided to retire. Rollo understood there had been enough destruction. Now the country required not another destroyer chieftain, but a lawful ruler capable of speaking with kings in their own language. The heir to this scorching hot realm was William, who would later be called Longsword. He embodied a new era. From the cradle he absorbed not only legends of Valhalla, but also the melody of French speech and the solemnity of Catholic masses. His hand, accustomed to heavy steel, held a quill with equal elegance, signing decrees. To the stern Jarls who came from across the sea, this youth in exquisite clothes looked like an outsider. William believed he would bring peace and legitimacy to his people, becoming part of the great Christian culture. But the more he turned into an enlightened duke, the faster he lost the support of his loyal warriors. This was a man trying to build a stone castle on the deck of a longship that was heaving under his feet. The founder of Normandy saw in his son the highest form of self-sacrifice. The old Viking consciously handed his legacy to someone who was his complete opposite. He realized what his comrades did not understand. The time of sea kings without shores was gone forever. William had already turned 30 when he accepted power, and he already commanded 30,000 furious warriors for whom the law was merely the right of the strong. The conflict of identities grew daily. While the Duke restored monasteries and strengthened feudal ties with the king, a conspiracy ripened in the shadows of the northern forests. The figure of Rollo still loomed over the country, and many believed that William was merely a pale copy of his father, incapable of true cruelty. The heir tried to rule with mercy and law, assuming that loyalty is bought with order. But he forgot that wolves tamed by his father do not eat from the hands of those they do not fear. Internal tension reached its limit when Jarl Riulf openly challenged the French bastard. William faced a terrible choice: run, abandoning the young nation, or turn into the very monster he so feared in his parent. It was the moment when Longsword had either to break or prove that his name was not just a tribute to fashion, but a death sentence for anyone who dared to dispute his right to power. And the first test would be the rebellion that would nearly drown Rouen in blood. By the year 933, the fragile peace William had so diligently built turned to ash. While the young duke restored abbeys and delved into the subtleties of feudal law, a whisper crawled through the northern lands, turning into a menacing roar. The rebels, led by Riulf, openly declared, "We do not need a king who prays in Latin. We need a chieftain who leads us into battle." All of France froze, watching as the young Norman state began to devour itself. Riulf gathered thousands of dissatisfied men under his banners, those who considered the ruler a weak Frenchman, unworthy of the blood of the great northern wolf. William looked from the fortress towers at the bonfires in the camp of his former comrades. He saw the faces of men with whom he had grown up and understood, today one of them must die so the country might live. His gaze picked out details, the glint of hundreds of axes, the ominous flapping of banners with ravens in the wind, and the heavy smell of river silt mixed with smoke. William's words crashed against the deaf fury of the Northmen. For people who recognized only the right of the sword, his eloquence looked like a sign of cowardice. Every peace proposal only poured oil on the fire of the rebellion. Dreaming of wise laws, the ruler found himself trapped. For the sake of peace, he had to unleash the bloodiest internal war. The battle at the gates of Rouen became the point of no return. Longsword personally led the charge, and it was here that his nickname found its true meaning. He hacked his way through the ranks of the rebels with a fury that Rollo himself would have envied. Thousands of warriors froze when they saw their duke drenched in enemy blood, standing over the body of the fallen Riulf. The blade knew no miss that day. The mutiny choked on its own blood. The year 934 marked the birth of a new leader. William ceased to be merely an heir. From now on, he was the absolute master. This victory cost the lives of many veterans of the North, but it bought Normandy the right to unity. The Duke proved to the Jarls that he knew how to kill. Now he had to convince the kings of his skill in winning a game where signatures on parchment and treacherous smiles at a feast table are used instead of axes. Having suppressed the internal threat, the ruler realized to hold the loyalty of his men, something more than fear was needed. New lands were required where his warriors could feel like lords. Peace in the state became possible only on the condition of its growth. It had to become too big for neighbors to ignore. The Duke turned his gaze to the west, toward the wild shores of the Cotentin and the fertile valleys of the Bessin. But every captured kilometer made him increasingly dangerous in the eyes of the French kings. Expansion of borders, which was supposed to bring stability, in reality only increased the area of his future prison. The Carolingians realized the northern wolf had grown teeth capable of biting through the throat of the entire dynasty. After the defeat of the rebels, the Duke realized Normandy would not survive in isolation amidst hostile counties. For neighbors to recognize him as an equal, he needed to shed the status of a simple jarl and transform into a fully fledged ruler. William was the first among the Northmen to grasp real power lies not in mountains of looted gold, but in the legality of land ownership. The tactic of lightning-fast raids was replaced by the aggressive absorption of neighboring lands. William busied himself with strengthening the new borders, the Bessin and the Cotentin. He designed the state like an architect. On the seized frontiers, the first castles rose up. Vassal dependency was introduced, along with strict tax collection. To yesterday's Vikings, such orders seemed like savagery. They were forced to trade axes for plows, and the right of the strong for obligations to a lord. The Duke saw how the Carolingian kings were drowning in intrigues, and masterfully used their weakness to secure rights to new possessions. He built diplomatic bridges, concluded marriage alliances and treaties. In 935, William married Liutgarde, daughter of Count Herbert II of Vermandois. This marriage was politically significant and gave him important lands, gradually weaving Normandy into the political pattern of France. William believed that the status of an ideal vassal guaranteed safety. However, the more powerful his duchy became, the more his neighbors trembled. A paradox arose. The man who dreamed of getting rid of the barbarian brand eventually turned into an even more dangerous predator than his father. Success in state building turned into a curse. Under his rule was a territory almost double the size of Rollo's inheritance by area. Normandy turned into the most organized principality of the region, where Scandinavian fury now served the feudal order. The law was observed here with the same frightening precision with which sword strikes were previously delivered. By the middle of his reign, William had achieved the impossible. He had turned into a key player in big politics, but the price of triumph proved exorbitant. A mind accustomed to military discipline began to burn out under the weight of the endless lies shrouding the throne. Outwardly, he looked like a mighty sovereign, but emptiness ripened inside. The man who had expanded the boundaries of his world to unprecedented limits suddenly realized he was losing the most important battle for his own soul. The Duke had achieved everything: lands, power, and recognition, but the glitter of the crown now seemed to him fake. In a reality where every word is soaked in lies, he sought a foothold in eternity. The ruler whose name made enemies tremble increasingly took shelter within monastic walls. His fascination with Christianity was rapidly growing into an obsession. He decided to restore the Jumièges Abbey, the very place his Viking ancestors had once betrayed to the fire. But behind this noble gesture lay a plan that nearly deprived Normandy of its ruler at the most dangerous moment. The Duke froze on the threshold of a cell, ready to lay down his long sword forever. Behind the facade of William's triumph hid a man whose mind had turned into a battlefield between the memory of a furious father and sincere faith. This internal discord led to the restoration of the Jumièges Abbey. The Duke personally supervised every stone laid, as if trying to atone for the blood spilled by his ancestors. He spent hours in prayer, exchanging exquisite silks for the simple robes of a novice. In such moments, the ruler sought not power, but silence. While William knelt, his enemies sharpened their blades. His deep piety nearly turned into a death sentence for all of Normandy. While the ruler dreamed of a cell, vassals began to sense the weakness of the throne, and enemies saw this as the ideal chance to strike. He tried to escape fate into a temple, while doom was already preparing the sharpened steel of betrayal for him. The desire to renounce the world proved so strong that the abbot of Jumièges had to forcibly hold the Duke back from taking monastic vows, reminding him of his duty. William remained on the throne, but turned into a reluctant ruler. In the eyes of neighbors, such as Count Arnulf of Flanders, such sarcastic spiritual softness looked like an open door into his dominions. 15 years of rule had made Normandy a prosperous principality, but he felt like a prisoner of this success. Every decision made only added weight to the sword he so desperately dreamed of laying down. In the end, duty outweighed the thirst for peace. William returned to active politics, hoping to establish peace throughout France by the power of treaties and the sanctity of the word. But it was precisely this faith in the decency of others that became his fatal mistake. The Duke returned to the game, assuming his authority and peacefulness would serve as a shield. He strove for stability, not realizing, for his enemies, the prosperous country itself was a bone in the throat. William agreed to a meeting with Count Arnulf of Flanders, believing that an honest dialogue would end years of internecine strife. Leaving his army behind, he entrusted himself to the miracle of diplomacy. The trap at the bridge of Picquigny was set with impeccable cruelty. William Longsword calculated on concluding peace, but was actually walking to his own execution. The irony lay in the fact that the man who feared violence more than anything in the world fell victim to the basest and most treacherous murder. December 942. William Longsword had outgrown his neighbors. He had turned a pirate enclave into a fully fledged state, inspiring mortal terror in Count Arnulf of Flanders. Peace negotiations on a tiny islet in the middle of the Somme promised William long-awaited stability without unnecessary blood. By the terms of the meeting, only the rulers were allowed on the bridge. The Duke stepped onto the shaky planks. His figure towered over the retinue, tall, calm, with the sword that today rested peacefully in its scabbard. He peered into Arnulf's face, sincerely believing he saw before him a pious Christian sovereign. The silence was broken only by the splashing of water and the sharp whistle of steel. When William turned toward his boat, the blow overtook him. The man who had spent his life taming the fury of his ancestors fell victim to a vile conspiracy. Assassins sent by Arnulf struck in the back. William proved powerless against the treachery of a dagger. A blade separated his head from his body, and his corpse disappeared into the icy waters of the river. The giant who built walls for his people ended his path on a narrow bridge that became his scaffold. The year 942 became a black date in the history of the North. William had barely turned 49. In the 15 years of his rule, he had accomplished more than many dynasties do in centuries. When the news of the ruler's death reached Rouen, the city froze. But the main paradox lay elsewhere. Longsword left behind not just lands, but the very idea of Normandy. His son Richard remained a child, yet the foundation of the state proved so solid that even this murder could not shake the walls of his house. William Longsword finished his father's work, turning a camp of raiders into a recognized duchy. But this was William's tragedy. Striving for peace and Christian mercy, the builder of walls fell victim to the very system he so desperately tried to fit into. True power requires not only conquests, but also the readiness to sacrifice oneself for the sake of the created order. This truth binds the times of the Carolingians with modernity. The death of the ruler became only the beginning of a great game. A man enters the stage whose childhood was spent in the shadow of betrayal. William's son, the complete opposite of his father. He did not seek peace in prayer. He razed fortresses and smelted Scandinavian fury into a new iron will, ready to conquer all of Europe. His name is Richard the Fearless. His history is a legend of survival that the world remembers to this day. Legacies are built on the choices we make in the darkest times. Which path would you have chosen? Subscribe to see how Richard forged his destiny. Like this video if the tragedy at the bridge of Picquigny touched you, and write in the comments, was William too weak for his time or too noble for a world of traitors? See you next time.